Have you ever held something in your hand that felt heavier than it should not? Because of its physical weight, but because of the weight of the memories it carries. That was me. 5 years after I had meticulously rebuilt my life from the ground up, standing in the sun-drenched quiet of my own living room, holding a piece of cardstock that felt like a tombstone. If you've ever been forced to choose between keeping the family peace and preserving your own soul, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You're going to understand this story on a spiritual level. The thing in my hand was an invitation. It was a thick, cream-colored square, embossed with shimmering gold calligraphy that screamed expense and a desperate need for approval. It was for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, a command performance, a summons. It wasn't an invitation to a party. It was a subpoena to appear at the scene of my own emotional crime. For 5 years, I had been blissfully, blessedly free. After the implosion, I had moved 3 states away, to a city where no one knew my name or my story. I was an architect, and my new life reflected it. My apartment was a minimalist sanctuary of clean lines, natural light, and quiet order. I had built a world for myself where every corner was peaceful. Every object had a purpose, and there were no ghosts. Until now, the invitation was a ghost, and it had just kicked down my front door, seeing the looping, pretentious script of my parents' names next to my sister's. It all came rushing back. 5 years vanished in an instant, and I was 28 again. Standing in the hallway of the house I thought was my future, listening to a sound that shattered my entire world. Laughter. It was my sister's laughter, high-pitched, musical, and utterly unmistakable. And it was coming from the bedroom I shared with my fiancé, Liam. I had come home a day early from a business trip. I had a bottle of his favorite wine in my bag and a stupid, giddy smile on my face, excited to surprise him. But the first thing I saw when I opened the door was a pair of shoes, a pair of ridiculously expensive, strappy red stilettos, Sarah's shoes, my younger sister, Serafina, the family's dazzling, dramatic, golden child. My blood went cold. Why were her shoes here? Why were they kicked off in the hallway like that? And then I heard it, her laugh, followed by the low, familiar rumble of Liam's. My Liam, the man I had loved for 4 years, the man whose ring was on my finger, the man I was supposed to spend the rest of my life with. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I walked down the hallway, my movements stiff and robotic, my heart a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The scene that met me is burned into my memory like a photograph. My sister, wearing one of Liam's dress shirts and nothing else, sitting on the edge of our bed, Liam, shirtless, standing in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. They were both laughing, caught in a private, intimate moment. In my home, in my bed, in my life. They saw me at the same time. Liam's face collapsed into a mask of pure, panicked horror. Hers was different for a split second. There was shock, but it was immediately replaced by something else. A look of defiance, a flicker of triumph. It was the look of a predator who had finally, successfully, cornered her prey. The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and suffocating. "Alara," Liam choked out, taking a step toward me, his hands held up as if to ward off a blow. This isn't what it looks like. Isn't it? My voice was a dead, flat thing I didn't recognize. It looks like my sister is in my bedroom, wearing my fiancé's shirt. Am I seeing it wrong? It just happened, Sarah said, her voice infuriatingly calm. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She stood up, the shirt gaping open, and crossed her arms. "You can't help who you fall in love with. Alara, you can't help who you fall in love with." She delivered the line like the tragic heroine of a romance novel. Not the villain in her own sister's nightmare. The sheer, narcissistic audacity of it was what broke my shock and let the pain in. It was a physical thing, a white-hot agony that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. A double betrayal. The 2 people in the world I had loved and trusted the most. What followed was a blur of ugly, jagged pieces, shouting, crying. Liam's pathetic, fumbling excuses about being confused. Sarah's cool, infuriating self-righteousness. I remember throwing the bottle of wine against the wall, watching the red liquid spread like blood across the white paint. And then I remember leaving, grabbing a bag and just walking out, leaving the ruins of my life behind me. I went to my parents' house, I thought, in my naivety, that I would find refuge there. I thought my mother would hold me. I thought my father would be incandescent with rage on my behalf. I was so wrong. The family meeting they called the next day wasn't an intervention for the two people who had just shattered a family. It was an intervention for me. We sat in their formal living room, a room reserved for important occasions and bad news. I was a wreck, hollowed out by grief and lack of sleep. Liam and Sarah sat together on the opposite sofa, a united front, looking somber and tragic. My parents sat in their matching armchairs, playing the role of grave, impartial judges. "We need to handle this as a family," my father began, his voice full of a false gravitas. Quietly, with dignity. "This is a terrible, unfortunate situation," my mother added, her eyes darting nervously toward the window, as if the neighbors could hear our family imploding. "But we cannot have a scandal. The wedding invitations have already been sent out. Deposits have been paid. What will people think?" I stared at her. "What will people think, Mom? Are you serious? Liam slept with my sister. Our wedding is off. That's the only thing that matters. Now, let's not be hasty," my father said, holding up a hand. "Liam made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But he is a good man, with a good career. He is a provider. It would be a shame to lose him from this family." I felt like I was in the twilight zone. "Lose him from the family, Dad. He cheated on me with your other daughter. And that is where you come in, Ilara," my mother said, her voice soft and persuasive. "You have always been the strong one, the sensible one. Sarah, she's more fragile, more impulsive. She follows her heart. And right now, her heart and Liam's heart, they seem to have found each other. It's a tragedy, but it's happened." I looked from my mother's pleading face to my father's stern one. I looked at Liam, who couldn't meet my eyes, and I looked at my sister, who was watching me with that same triumphant gleam in her eye. And I understood. They weren't here to comfort me. They were here to manage me. They were asking me to be the bigger person. They were asking me to quietly step aside, to swallow my pain and my humiliation, so that my sister could have my fiancé without any messy, inconvenient drama. They were asking me to sacrifice myself on the altar of family peace. "So what you're saying," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "is that I am expected to just disappear, to give them my blessing and fade into the background so you don't have to return any wedding gifts." "Don't be dramatic, Ilara," my father said sharply. "We are asking you to be mature. We are asking you to think of the family in that moment." I realized I had not just lost Liam and Sarah. I had lost my parents, too. They had looked at this catastrophic betrayal, at their two daughters, and they had chosen the dazzling, fragile, golden child over the steady, sensible, inconvenient one. They always had. I stood up. "I will not be a part of this," I said, my voice shaking with a rage that was so cold it felt like ice. "I will not be quiet, and I will not protect them from the consequences of what they've done." I walked out of that house, and I did not look back. I packed my life into my car, broke my lease, quit my job, and I drove. I drove for 2 days, until I found a city where the air felt clean and the streets didn't whisper my name. And for 5 years, I had stayed quiet, not for them, but for me. I had needed the silence to heal, to rebuild, to become someone they could no longer touch. And now, this gilded invitation, a summons back to the scene of the crime, to celebrate the 40-year union of the two people who had so callously presided over the dissolution of mine. I stood there in my sunlit apartment, the silence that I had cultivated for years suddenly feeling fragile. They wanted me to come back. They wanted me to play my part in their happy family portrait, to be the forgiven, forgotten ghost at their anniversary feast. For 5 years, my answer would have been a resounding, unequivocal no. But today was different. I was different. I was no longer the shattered, 28-year-old girl. I was a 33-year-old woman who had built a life, a career, and a new love from the ashes of their betrayal. A slow smile spread across my face. It probably wasn't the reaction they were expecting. I walked over to my desk, picked up my favorite fountain pen, and uncapped it. I looked at the RSVP card. Kindly respond by. I ticked the box next to will attend. Then I moved to the line that said, name of guest, and in my neatest, most confident script, I wrote his name, Julian Sterling. They wanted me to come back. Fine, but I wasn't coming back alone. I placed the RSVP card on my marble coffee table, the gold calligraphy glinting in the afternoon sun. Julian Sterling, seeing his name written there, a tangible link between my past and my present, sent a ripple through time. My mind drifted back across the 5 years I had fought so hard to survive. The years I had spent in silence, meticulously building the life and the woman who was now strong enough to accept such an invitation. It had not been an easy or a linear path. My escape to Chicago, in the beginning, was not a brave new start. It was a retreat. I arrived in a city of millions and had never felt more alone. I rented a small, empty apartment with white walls that seemed to scream with the silence my family had demanded of me. For the first 6 months, I was a ghost. I was haunted by the memory of Sarah's triumphant smile and Liam's panicked face. I would replay that scene in the living room over and over, the words, the looks, the betrayal, a constant, looping film in my mind. I tried to work, but my creativity, the very core of my identity as an architect, was gone. I would sit in front of my drafting screen for hours, but my mind was a fog. I couldn't create order on paper when my own soul was in such profound chaos. I lived on savings, takeout, and a grief so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my chest. I had hit rock bottom. I had lost my fiancé, my sister, my parents, my home, and my career, all in one catastrophic blow. I had nothing left. The turning point wasn't a single, dramatic moment of clarity. It was a slow, painful crawl back to the light. It started with therapy. I found a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sharma, whose office felt like a sanctuary. In that quiet room, for the first time, I was allowed to be angry. I was allowed to be broken. I was allowed to grieve not just for the loss of my relationship, but for the loss of the family I thought I had. You have spent your entire life in the role of the sensible one, she told me during one session, her words unlocking a door in my mind I didn't even know was there. It was your job to be calm so that your sister could be dramatic. It was your job to be responsible so she could be free. They didn't just betray you, Alara. They punished you for finally deviating from the role they had written for you. Week by week, we unpacked it all, the lifetime of subtle comparisons, the way my quiet achievements were always overshadowed by Sarah's noisy dramas, the way my parents had always expected me to be the emotional shock absorber for the entire family. The betrayal hadn't been a sudden aberration. It was the logical, brutal conclusion to a lifetime of toxic dynamics. Healing began when I finally accepted that the family I was mourning had never really existed. They were a myth I had told myself. And with that acceptance came a sliver of freedom. My work was the next piece of my salvation. I started small. I took on a tiny project designing a custom bookshelf for a client. The act of taking chaotic raw materials wood, screws, measurements, and creating something beautiful, structured, and functional was a form of therapy in itself. I was creating order. I was building something that made sense in a world that didn't. The bookshelf led to a kitchen remodel. The kitchen led to a small house renovation. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to rebuild my career, and with it, my confidence. My work became my focus. I poured all the pain, all the anger, all the grief into my designs, and my work became better than it had ever been. It was imbued with a depth, a sense of purpose, a maturity that had been missing before. I wasn't just designing houses anymore. I was designing sanctuaries, spaces of peace and order, the very things I had been so desperately craving for myself. And then I met Julian. It was 2 years into my new life. I had just landed my first major solo project designing the new downtown headquarters for a large philanthropic foundation. Julian was the chairman of the board. Our first meeting was in a sterile, impersonal boardroom. But he was anything but. I had been expecting a stuffy, older businessman, but Julian was different. He was sharp and intelligent, with kind eyes that seemed to see everything. He didn't dominate the meeting. He listened. He asked insightful, penetrating questions about my design philosophy, about the flow of light and space, about how architecture could foster a sense of community. He was interested in my mind, not just my portfolio. He was the client. But over the months of schematics and blueprints and site visits, he became something more, a friend, a confidant. He was the calmest person I had ever met, a quiet, solid presence that was the complete antithesis of my family's frantic, needy energy and Liam's anxious, performative ambition. Our relationship grew slowly, organically, built on a foundation of mutual respect and intellectual connection long before it ever became romantic. He never pushed me to talk about my past, but he created a space of such profound safety that, one evening, over dinner, I found myself telling him everything. I laid out the whole ugly story, Sarah, Liam, my parents, the silence. I was terrified, halfway through, that he would see me as damaged goods, as a woman with too much baggage. When I finished, my voice trembling, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice full of a gentle sincerity. "I'm not sorry you went through that, because it forged the incredible woman who is sitting in front of me right now." He squeezed my hand. "But I am heartbroken for them, because they lost the best thing they ever had, and they're too blind to even know it." He didn't see me as broken. He saw me as forged. In that moment, he didn't just heal a part of my heart. He gave it back to me, stronger than it was before. I learned about his life in pieces, too. He was a businessman, a very successful one, who had built his tech empire from the ground up. But he never led with that. He was defined by his kindness, his integrity, and his quiet, unshakable confidence, not by his net worth. He was the first person I had ever met who understood the difference between price and value. He was everything I had never known I was looking for. He was my peace. We married a year ago in a small private ceremony on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. It was just the two of us, a witness, and the sound of the waves. It was the opposite of the big, splashy, performative wedding I had been planning with Liam. It was real. Now, standing in my living room, the gilded invitation on my table, I looked at the life I had built, a career that fulfilled me, a home that was a sanctuary, a husband who saw me, the real me, and loved me not in spite of my scars, but because of them. The old Alara, the girl from 5 years ago, would have been terrified by this invitation. She would have seen it as a threat, a summons to her own execution. She would have done anything to avoid it, to keep the peace, to stay silent. But I wasn't her anymore. The invitation wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity, not for revenge, not for a dramatic confrontation, but for closure. It was a chance to walk back into the ruins of my old life, not as a ghost, but as the architect of my new one. It was a chance to show them, and to show myself, that I had not just survived their betrayal. I had, in the quiet, anonymous years that followed, built something far more beautiful in its place. Julian came into the room, home from a business trip, and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "What's that?" he asked, his voice a warm, familiar rumble in my ear, nodding toward the card on the table. "It's just an invitation," I said, leaning back against his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart, "to a party, my parents' 40th anniversary." He was quiet for a moment. He knew what that meant. "Are you going to go?" he asked, his voice gentle, with no hint of pressure. I turned in his arms to face him and smiled, a real, calm, confident smile. "We are," I said. I think it's time they finally met my husband. The drive to the anniversary party felt like a journey into a foreign country, one I used to call home. Julian sat in the passenger seat, a quiet, solid presence. He didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter or ask if I was okay for the 10th time. He just reached over and placed his hand on mine, his thumb gently stroking my knuckles. He knew I didn't need a cheerleader. I needed an anchor, and he was the calmest, strongest anchor a woman could ask for. The party was being held at the Botanical Gardens Conservatory, a place my mother adored. It was a massive, glittering glass house, and at night, with the gardens lit up around it, it was admittedly stunning. It also felt, appropriately, like a giant, beautifully decorated fishbowl, a place where everyone was on display. As we walked in, the first thing that hit me was the sheer, overwhelming performance of it all. A string quartet was playing softly. Waiters in white coats circulated with trays of champagne. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and my mother's ambition. And everyone, absolutely everyone, was dressed to the nines. Their laughter a little too loud, their smiles a little too bright. Our entrance caused a small, almost imperceptible ripple in the perfectly curated pond of the party. Conversations near the door faltered for a half-second. Heads turned, eyes widened. It was the look people give a ghost. I was the ghost of their past, the uncomfortable secret they had all agreed to bury. And I had just decided to crash their party. My mother, a heat-seeking missile for any potential social disruption, spotted us immediately. She glided across the floor, her smile stretched painfully tight across her face, her eyes flashing a silent, frantic warning. Behave. Do not make a scene. Alara, darling, you came, she chirped, pulling me into a hug that was as stiff and cold as the glass walls around us. We were so worried you wouldn't make it. You sent an invitation, Mom, so I came, I said, my voice neutral. She pulled back, her eyes flicking over me, then landing on Julian. Her smile softened, but it was tinged with a new emotion appraisal. She was assessing him, categorizing him, trying to figure out where he fit in her social hierarchy. And you must be Julian, she said. Alara told us so little about you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Helen, Julian said, his voice a calm, deep rumble. He shook her hand, and then my father's, who had lumbered over, looking deeply uncomfortable. So, Julian, my father began, getting straight to the point, as was his way. What line of work are you in? I work primarily in the technology and finance sectors, Julian answered. His response polite but perfectly vague. Finance, my father boomed, relieved to be on familiar ground. My son, Alex, is in finance, investment banking, a real shark. You two must have a chat later. He had already dismissed Julian as a lesser entity, a mere satellite in our golden boy's orbit. They said a few more pleasantries, their eyes constantly darting back to me, checking my expression, monitoring my mood, as if I were a volatile, unpredictable substance that might explode at any moment. The whole interaction was excruciating. And then I saw them. They were moving through the crowd, a perfect golden couple, the sun and moon of my family's universe. My sister, Sarah, looked radiant. She was wearing a slinky, emerald green dress that probably cost a fortune, her blonde hair catching the light. She was laughing, her hand resting possessively on the arm of her husband, my ex-fiancé, Liam. He looked older. The boyish charm that had once captivated me had hardened into a kind of anxious, corporate handsomeness. He wore a well-tailored suit, but his shoulders were tight, his smile a little forced. He looked successful. He did not, however, look happy. They saw us at the same time. For a split second, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated panic in Liam's eyes. Sarah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then reformed, brighter and more brittle than before. She took a deep breath and led him toward us, her head held high. It was a power move. She was not going to hide. She was going to confront the ghost head-on. Alara, she said, her voice a cascade of sickeningly sweet warmth. She pulled me into a hug, her perfume cloying and expensive. Oh my God, it is so good to see you. She pulled back, her hands gripping my arms, her eyes doing a swift, invasive scan of my face. You look healthy, she said, her voice full of a gentle, condescending wonder. She made the word healthy sound like I had just been released from a long-term care facility. I am healthy, Sarah, I said, my voice calm. I'm so glad you're finally in a place where you felt you could come, she continued, her voice loud enough for the people around us to hear. She was playing the part of the gracious, forgiving sister. We've all missed you so much. I've prayed for this day. You know, The day you would heal enough to be with us again. The sheer, monumental audacity of her words almost took my breath away. She had prayed for the day I would heal, not for the day she would atone for her sins, but for the day I would get over them. The narrative was clear. I was the one who had been broken, and she was the benevolent angel who had been patiently waiting for me to recover. Liam just stood beside her, a handsome, silent puppet, nodding along. "It's great to see you, Ilara," he mumbled, his eyes darting everywhere but my face. "Really, you look great. And this must be your friend," Sarah said, her eyes finally landing on Julian, her tone a mixture of dismissal and morbid curiosity. "This is my husband, Julian," I said, the words feeling solid and real in the fragile, artificial atmosphere. "Oh," she said, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Oh, how wonderful for you. It's so nice that you found someone." Again, the condescension was suffocating. "So nice that even you, my broken, sad sack sister, managed to find a man." They shook Julian's hand, made a few more minutes of excruciatingly polite small talk, and then excused themselves, melting back into the adoring crowd. Julian squeezed my hand. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "I'm fine," I said. And to my own surprise, it was true. 5 years ago, that interaction would have shattered me. Tonight, it felt like watching a play with a cast of bad actors. I was no longer a character in their drama. I was just a member of the audience. For the next hour, we navigated the party, a minefield of pitying looks and whispered comments. Relatives and old family friends would approach me, their faces etched with a sad, morbid curiosity. "Amelia, dear, how are you really?" my great Aunt Carol asked, her hand clutching my arm. "I'm wonderful, Aunt Carol," I said with a smile. "We were all so worried," she continued, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "But you look well, a bit thin. Perhaps this new fellow, Julian, is he good to you?" They were all treating me like a priceless, fragile vase that had been shattered and painstakingly glued back together. They were admiring the repair job, but they were terrified that a single loud noise might make me fall apart again. They had no idea I wasn't made of porcelain anymore. I was made of steel and concrete, with a solid gold foundation named Julian. He was my anchor through it all. When my father tried to pull me into a conversation about Liam's brilliant career, Julian smoothly redirected the conversation to a neutral topic. When my mother started to tell a long, rambling, Sarah-centric story, he would catch my eye and give me a small, secret smile. He was there, a quiet, unshakable wall between me and their world. Finally, my father tapped a spoon against a champagne glass, the clear, high-pitched sound calling for everyone's attention. It was time for the toasts. If everyone could gather around, he boomed. My mother herded Sarah and Liam to the center of the room, positioning them next to the towering 5-tiered anniversary cake. She placed them at her side, the picture of the perfect, successful family. Julian and I stood near the back of the crowd. We had been placed at a table in the proverbial Siberia, far from the head table of honor. The spotlight was now on them, the real family. I was, as I had always been, relegated to the shadows. But for the first time in my life, I was comfortable there. I wasn't a resentful ghost anymore. I was an architect, observing the structural integrity of the building, and from where I was standing, I could see all the cracks in the foundation. My father, champagne flute in hand, stood to begin the toasts. He started, as he always did, with a long, rambling tribute to my mother and their 40 years of marriage. It was a well-rehearsed speech, full of familiar anecdotes and sentimental cliches. But it wasn't really about them. It was a warm-up act. The main event, I knew, was coming. After a round of polite applause for my parents, my father beamed, his chest puffing out. "But a milestone like this isn't just about looking back," he boomed, his eyes finding Sarah and Liam in the crowd. "It's about looking forward, to the future, to legacy. And tonight, I am so proud to look at my beautiful daughter, Serafina, and my son-in-law, Liam, and see that legacy in action. They are building a life of success, a life of happiness, and as they have just shared with us, they are about to bring the next generation of our family into this world." He raised his glass, To Sarah and Liam, and to my future grandchild. The room erupted. There were cheers, whistles, and a fresh wave of applause that was far more enthusiastic than the one my parents had received. My mother burst into genuine, happy tears. Relatives rushed forward to hug a glowing, radiant Sarah, who placed a perfectly manicured hand on her still flat stomach. I stood next to Julian in the back of the room, a glass of untouched champagne in my hand, and I felt a strange, distant ache. It wasn't the sharp, agonizing pain of 5 years ago. It was a phantom limb, a dull throb where a future I had once planned used to be. Liam and I had talked about children. We had picked out names. Now, he was having a child with my sister, and my parents were celebrating the fruit of their betrayal as the future of the family. You see, dear Ahit, my great-aunt Carol whispered, appearing at my elbow as if summoned by the emotional maelstrom. She squeezed my arm, her touch meant to be comforting, but feeling like a brand. It all worked out for the best. Everything happens for a reason. If that unpleasantness hadn't happened, we wouldn't be celebrating this little miracle now, would we? That unpleasantness. She had reduced the complete demolition of my life to that unpleasantness. My agony, my years of grief and rebuilding, had been nothing more than a necessary, if unfortunate, plot point in the grand love story of Sarah and Liam. They weren't villains in this narrative. They were the romantic heroes, and I was just the tragic backstory that made their happily ever after all the more poignant. I just smiled, a tight, meaningless smile, and said nothing. The party's energy now coalesced around the golden couple. Liam, emboldened by the announcement and the celebratory mood, was in his element. He stood with a circle of my father's business acquaintances, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Holding court, he was no longer the awkward, guilty ex-fiancé. He was the successful, soon-to-be father, a man at the peak of his powers, and he wanted everyone to know it. "It's a whole new ballgame at the firm, I'm telling you," he said, his voice carrying across the room. I could hear him perfectly from my quiet corner. The whole culture has shifted since Sterling took over. Julian, who had been quietly observing the scene beside me, stiffened almost imperceptibly at the mention of the name. I gave his hand a small squeeze. "Who's Sterling?" my Uncle Bill asked. "Julian Sterling," Liam said, the name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. "The new CEO. The man is a legend, a ghost. He bought out our parent company 6 months ago. No one's ever seen him. He works out of the San Francisco office, but you feel his presence. He's a genius. He's gutting the entire leadership structure, cutting all the dead weight. You have to be at the absolute top of your game, or you're out. It's brutal, but it's brilliant." My father, who had been listening in, nodded sagely. "That's how it's done. A real leader. You need to get in front of this man. Liam." "That's the goal," Liam said, taking a large gulp of his whiskey. The anxiety I had seen in him earlier was back, hidden under a thin veneer of bravado. "I've been putting in 80-hour weeks, reworking the Kensington proposal. My boss says if I can get it just right, it might end up on Sterling's desk. And if I can get 5 minutes in a room with Julian Sterling, if I can just get him to see my value, I know I can seal the deal on the VP promotion." He was performing, desperately. He was trying to impress my father, to justify his position in the family, to prove that the life he had chosen, the life he had stolen from me, was a successful one. He was chasing the approval of a man he had never even met, a ghost, a legend named Julian Sterling. I glanced at the real Julian Sterling, who was standing beside me, looking at Liam with a calm, unreadable expression. He had a slight frown on his face, the look of a man listening to a stranger talk about him at a party. The dramatic irony was so thick, so absurd, it was almost comical. "Well, you'll do it, son," my father boomed, clapping Liam on the back. "A man like that, this Sterling, he'll recognize a fellow shark when he sees one." A fellow shark, I thought of Liam's panicked call to his old college buddy a few months after we split. Begging for a loan, I knew because the friend, riddled with guilt, had called me to tell me Liam wasn't a shark. He was a guppy, swimming in a tank far too big for him, terrified of being eaten. Sarah glided over to Liam and looped her arm through his, her smile radiant. "Don't worry, darling," she cooed, loud enough for us all to hear. He'll see how brilliant you are. You're going to be a vice president before this baby is even born. I know it. They were a perfect symphony of self-congratulation, their entire performance built on a foundation of lies and a future they were counting on but hadn't yet earned. And my family was their adoring, cheering audience. It was in that moment that Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted slightly. "Excuse me, darling," he whispered, his lips close to my ear. "I have to take this. It's about that Singapore deal I mentioned. I'll be right back." He gave my hand a final, reassuring squeeze and then moved quietly toward the glass doors of the conservatory, disappearing into the darkness of the gardens outside. His exit was so discreet that no one, except me, even noticed he was gone. Liam was still talking, spinning tales of his ambition, of his strategy, of how he was going to conquer the corporate world and win the approval of the great Julian Sterling. I just stood there, a ghost in my own family, the only person in the room who knew the truth, the only one who knew that the mythical, legendary CEO Liam was so desperate to impress, had just stepped outside to close a multi-billion-dollar deal, and that in a few minutes. He would be coming back to stand by my side. The symphony of their success was reaching its crescendo, and I had a feeling the finale was going to be spectacular. Julian's quiet exit left a vacuum that Liam was more than happy to fill with the sound of his own voice. With the object of his obsession, the mythical CEO, momentarily out of the picture, Liam turned his attention back to cementing his status as the family's resident business guru. He was peacocking, his chest puffed out, his words a torrent of corporate jargon and thinly veiled self-praise. "Sterling is playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers," Liam announced to my father and a small, captive audience of uncles. "He's not about sentiment, he's about results. Pure, cold, hard numbers. That's why I know the Kensington proposal is a winner. It's aggressive, it's lean, and it's going to add a solid 9 figures to the bottom line. It's a proposal a man like Sterling will understand." My father was nodding along, his eyes shining with pride. "That's my boy, speaking the language of power." I just stood in the background, a silent ghost at their feast of ambition, and marveled at the caricature Liam had created. He had built a version of Julian in his mind, a ruthless, number-crunching corporate raider that was a projection of his own desperate aspirations. He had no idea the real Julian was a man who spent his Saturday mornings volunteering at a dog shelter and had a passion for restoring antique books. Liam wasn't just chasing a ghost. He was chasing the wrong ghost entirely. It was in that moment, as Liam was explaining the nuances of synergistic acquisitions, that the glass doors to the garden slid open. Julian walked back in. He wasn't the same relaxed man who had walked out. The easygoing, gentle partner had been replaced by the CEO. There was a subtle shift in his posture, a focused, almost dangerous intensity in his eyes. He was looking down at his phone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen as he walked. He spoke into his watch, his voice low but clear. "Tell the team in Singapore the final wire is approved. I want the deal closed and announced before their market opens. No excuses." The words, spoken with such casual, world-spanning authority, were a silent thunderclap that only I could feel. He was closing a deal on the other side of the planet, while my ex-fiancé was bragging about a proposal that hadn't even been read yet. Liam, his back to the door, didn't see him, but Sarah did. Her eyes widened, and she nudged her husband, hard. "Liam," she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper. "Look." Liam turned. He followed her gaze, and he saw him. He saw the man whose grainy corporate headshot he had probably studied for hours, the man whose name he had been invoking like a prayer, the legend, the ghost. Julian Sterling was here, in the same room, breathing the same air. The transformation in Liam was instantaneous and grotesque. The confident, boastful banker vanished, replaced by a nervous, eager supplicant. His back straightened. He smoothed his tie. A frantic, sycophantic smile plastered itself across his face. This was it. This was the moment. The chance of a lifetime. Delivered to him on a silver platter at his in-laws' anniversary party. "Oh my God," he breathed, his eyes wide with a kind of terrified ecstasy. "That's him. That's Julian Sterling." "Go," Sarah urged, giving him a little push. "Go talk to him now. This is your chance. He didn't need to be told twice. He was a man possessed. He practically scurried across the room, dodging a waiter and narrowly avoiding my great-aunt Carol. He was a heat-seeking missile of ambition, and Julian was his target. Julian, having finished his call, had pocketed his phone and was now walking toward me, a small apologetic smile already forming on his lips for having been gone so long. He hadn't seen Liam coming. Liam intercepted him halfway across the room, physically planting himself in Julian's path. "Mr. Sterling," Liam gushed, his voice a full octave higher than usual. "Sir, I am so sorry to bother you." Julian stopped, taken by surprise. He looked at this strange, overly eager man in front of him with a look of polite, professional confusion. He had no idea who this person was. "Liam Parker," Liam continued, thrusting his hand forward for a handshake. "From the acquisitions department at Sterling Vance. It is an absolute, unmitigated honor to meet you, sir. I am a huge admirer of your work. Your vision for the company is, frankly, transformative. What you did with the Viridian acquisition was nothing short of genius." He was practically bowing. He was laying it on so thick it was a wonder Julian wasn't drowning in it. His hand remained extended, hanging in the air between them, trembling slightly with a mixture of nerves and adrenaline. My father, mother, and sister were watching from across the room, their faces alight with pride and anticipation. This was it. The moment their golden boy connected with the king, Julian looked at the fawning man in front of him. He looked at the desperately outstretched hand. Then his eyes flickered past Liam and found me, standing a few feet away. The cool, professional mask on his face softened instantly. His eyes crinkling at the corners in a private smile meant only for me. He gave Liam a curt, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but utterly dismissive. And then he simply walked around him. He didn't shake the hand. He didn't respond to the praise. He just bypassed Liam as if he were a piece of furniture, a minor obstacle on the path back to his wife. Liam's hand was left hanging in the empty air. His sycophantic smile froze, then began to crumble. The color drained from his face. He had just shot his shot, in front of his entire family, and the great Julian Sterling had looked at him like he was nothing, a piece of lint on the corporate suit. The public humiliation was total and absolute. My family, watching from the sidelines, was stunned into silence. Their triumphant narrative had just hit a major, inexplicable snag. Why would the CEO be so rude? Why would he blow off their brilliant son-in-law? They didn't have to wait long for the answer. Julian reached my side. The cool, distant CEO who had just snubbed Liam vanished, replaced in an instant by the warm, affectionate man I loved. He took both of my hands in his. "Sorry about that, darling," he murmured, his voice low and full of love, for my ears only. That call took longer than I expected. And then, in a simple, gentle gesture that landed with the force of a nuclear bomb in the center of my family's universe, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a long kiss, just a soft, familiar press of his lips to mine. But in that room, at that moment, it was the loudest thing that had ever happened. He pulled back, his eyes smiling into mine. "The deal's closed, by the way," he added, as if it were an afterthought. I just smiled back at him, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes for the first time that night. "I'm glad," I said. And then we both turned, together, to face the silent, frozen, horrified faces of my family. They were all staring at us, their mouths agape. They were looking at Liam, who looked like he had just been struck by lightning, and they were looking at Sarah, whose face was a shattered mask of disbelief. But mostly, they were looking at Julian, the mythical CEO, the ghost, the legend, who was standing with his arm wrapped lovingly, possessively, around the waist of the quiet, broken sister they had all pitied and cast aside. The ghost they had tried to exorcise was married to the king they worshipped. The puzzle pieces of their world, the pieces that had me at the bottom and them at the top, had just been slammed together into a new, impossible, and horrifying picture. And my sister's smile. It was finally, beautifully, gone. The kiss was the pebble, and the stunned silence that followed was the ripple, spreading outwards until it had engulfed the entire room. Time seemed to slow down, my family, who had been a whirlwind of noise and triumphant celebration just moments before, were now a frozen tableau of shock. I watched the comprehension dawn on each of their faces, and it was like watching a series of slow-motion car crashes. Liam was the first casualty. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a pasty, sickly white. The desperate, sycophantic smile he had plastered on for Julian was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed look of pure, unadulterated horror. I could see the frantic calculations happening behind his eyes. The woman he had cheated on, betrayed, and discarded 5 years ago was married to the man he had just spent the last hour worshipping as a god. The man who held his entire professional future in the palm of his hand. He had just tried to sell his ambition to the CEO, only to discover that the CEO was married to the human wreckage he had left behind. His worlds hadn't just collided, they had annihilated each other. My parents were next. Their faces were a comical, tragic mask of confusion. They looked from me to Julian and back again. Their brains were trying to reconcile two completely incompatible narratives. Alara, the quiet, broken, pity case, and Alara, the wife of the legendary Julian Sterling. The two images could not coexist. The entire hierarchy of their world, the one with Alex and Sarah at the top and me at the bottom, had just been blown to pieces. My father looked like a man who had just discovered the laws of gravity had been a lie all along. But my focus, my entire world in that moment, was on my sister. I watched Sarah's face, the radiant, victorious, condescending smile she had been wearing all night. The smile that had haunted my dreams for 5 years didn't just fade, it shattered. It was like watching a beautiful, delicate piece of porcelain crack and break apart, revealing the ugly, terrified, and deeply insecure reality underneath. The triumphant gleam in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dawning, panicked horror. She looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time that night, and I knew what she was seeing. She wasn't seeing her sad, broken older sister anymore. She was seeing the woman who had effortlessly won the prize she never even knew she was competing for. Her entire life, her marriage to Liam, the pregnancy, the house, it had all been her victory lap. She had won the man. She had won the life I was supposed to have. But in this one, single, devastating moment, her victory was exposed for what it was, a consolation prize. She hadn't won Liam. She had just picked up my leftovers. The silence was finally broken by my mother, who, true to form, immediately went into frantic damage control mode. "Julian," she gasped, her voice a high-pitched, unnatural thing. "Julian Sterling." "Oh my goodness, we had no idea, Alara. You sly thing. Why didn't you ever tell us?" She started to flutter toward us, her hands outstretched, a desperate, fawning smile now plastered on her face. She was trying to realign herself, to pivot toward the new, overwhelming source of power in the room. Julian created a protective bubble around me with his arm, stopping her advance without a single aggressive move. "Helen, Robert," he said, his voice calm and polite, but with an unmistakable edge of steel. "Alara and I tend to keep our professional and our private lives separate. We're just here tonight to celebrate your anniversary." The subtext was crystal clear. The time for you to be in our private lives is over. My father, having recovered slightly from his initial shock, tried to salvage the situation. "Well, I'll be," he blustered, trying to laugh it off. "Julian Sterling, my son-in-law. Who would have thought we'll have to get you out on the golf course sometime?" "That's very kind of you, Robert," Julian said, his voice still coolly polite. "But we'll be flying back to San Francisco in the morning. My schedule is quite full for the foreseeable future." Another polite, but brutal, shutdown. There would be no golfing. There would be no cozying up to the new center of power. The door was closed. I looked over at Sarah and Liam. They were still frozen, standing alone in the middle of the room. Liam couldn't look at anyone. He was staring at the floor, his face pale green. A man who had just watched his career and his marriage get devalued in real time. And Sarah? She was just staring at me. Her face was a ruin. The shattered smile had been replaced by an expression of such raw, ugly jealousy that it was almost pitiable. All her triumph, all her smug satisfaction, had curdled into poison. I felt nothing. That was the most surprising part. I had imagined this moment, in my darkest hours, 1,000 times. I had imagined a confrontation, a dramatic speech, a moment of fiery vengeance. I had imagined feeling a hot, triumphant thrill at seeing her world crumble. But in the reality of it, I felt none of that. There was no anger, no hatred, no satisfaction. There was just a quiet, sad, and profound sense of closure. The wound they had carved into me 5 years ago had finally healed over. Not because they were suffering, but because their opinions, their actions, their very existence no longer had the power to cause me pain. I turned to my husband, the man who had shown me what real love, real support, and real strength looked like. "I think we're ready to go, darling," I said softly. He looked down at me, his eyes full of love and understanding. "I think you're right," he said. We turned to my parents. "Thank you for the invitation," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Happy anniversary." And then we walked away. We walked past my frozen, horrified relatives. We walked past my father, who was left speechless. We walked past my mother, who looked like she was about to burst into tears of social ruin. As we neared the door, we had to walk past Sarah and Liam. Liam wouldn't look up, but Sarah's eyes were locked on me, blazing with a desperate, silent question. How? I didn't offer an answer. I didn't offer a smile, or a sneer, or a single word. I just gave her a calm, level look of utter finality. The ghost was leaving the building, for good. We walked out of that glittering glass house and into the cool, clean night air, and as the door swished shut behind us, cutting off the suffocating drama of my past, I took a deep breath, and I felt light. The weight I had been carrying for 5 years, the weight of their betrayal, their judgment, their narrative, it was gone. In the car, driving away, Julian reached over and took my hand. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I am," I said, and the words were the truest I had ever spoken. "It's over. It's really, finally over." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "I'm proud of you." I looked out the window at the city lights blurring past. "It's funny," I said, a small, real laugh bubbling up inside me. I spent 5 years dreading this night. I thought seeing them would be the hardest thing in the world, but it wasn't. The real victory hadn't happened tonight, in that conservatory. The real victory had happened in the quiet moments of the last 5 years. It had happened in Dr. Sharma's office. It had happened over my drafting table at 2 in the morning. It had happened on the day I met Julian and allowed myself to trust again. It had happened every single day I chose to build my own life, instead of mourning the one that was stolen from me. Tonight wasn't a battle. It was just a confirmation, a final, public confirmation that while they had been busy polishing their stolen, second-rate trophy, I had been quietly, patiently, building a kingdom. They thought they had won because they ended up with each other. They never understood that my real prize wasn't Liam. It was myself. And that was a prize my sister could never, ever steal. So, if you're out there, and you're healing from a betrayal so deep you think it might have broken you forever, just know this. The best revenge isn't loud, it's quiet. It isn't about their downfall. It's about your rise. It's about building a life so full of your own joy, your own peace, and your own success, that when you finally look back at the people who hurt you, you feel nothing at all.